Okay, this is problems 3, 4, video for the test review, and this is going to be problems 3, 4, and 5. So it was found that the mean length of 100 parts produced by a lathe was 20.05 with a standard deviation of 0.02. Sketch the normal, that's key. They're telling us, we have a key word here telling us we're working with the normal curve with the lathe's mean and standard deviation that illustrates the empirical rule and fill in the blanks using the estimates from the empirical rule. All right, so I'm just going to tell you question 3, question 4, and question 5 all deal with the same scenario. So I'm going to draw this on a separate sheet of paper so I don't have to keep drawing it, so that way it speeds the video time up for you guys. So here we go. First off, I'm going to draw a normal curve. And my normal curves aren't perfect, and I'm sure yours won't be either, and that's okay. That is just what it is. And I know my center is here, 0. And then I'm going to need to divide this up so that I have 3 spaces that are about the same. So 1, 2, 3. So that's one standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, 3 standard deviations, 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, 3 standard deviations. So this is -1, -2, and -3. All right. So these right here represent z-scores. This whole row represents z-scores. So we have 1 z-score, 2 z-score, 3 z-score, -1, -2, -3. They tell us when we read this thing, produce was 0.05, the mean was 20.05. So this right here is 20.05. And they tell us it has a standard deviation of 0.02. All right, so I'm going to write mu equals 20.05, standard deviation equals 0.02, just so I don't forget. All right, so what percent of the parts are within plus or minus 1 standard deviation? Well, if we're working with the empirical rule, we don't even need to look this up because this is just an estimate, and we just need to memorize that plus or minus 1 standard deviation is 68%. All right, so that's you need to memorize. So what is the lower bound for the plus or minus 1 standard deviation? All right, so they're asking us for this -1 value. Well, they told me my standard deviation was 0.02. So I'm just going to take 20.05 and subtract 0.02. And that gives me 20.03. And that's my -1 value. So this right here is 20.03. And they ask for the lower bound. That's the lower bound of plus or minus 1, 20.03. Then it asks for the upper bound, all right? For the upper bound of plus or minus 1, that means right here on the positive side, because these right here are positive, all of them. So now I'm going to take 20.05 and just add 0.02. So 20.05 plus 0.02 is 20.07. And that's the upper bound. And from here to here, within this range, is 68%. So if I shaded this, this would have 68%. 68% of the data lies within that range. All right, number 4, I'm not going to read it to you because it's exactly the same problem. So I'm going to keep going with what I've already done. And basically we have a mean of 20.05, a standard deviation of 0.02. And they're going to ask us, they say, what percent of the parts are within plus or minus 2 standard deviations? Well, again, we're dealing with the empirical rule. We're dealing with the empirical rule, and if it's plus or minus 2, that means that's 95%. And once again, that's not exact, that's a rough estimate, but you need to memorize it for the empirical rule. It's going to be 95% for plus or minus 2. Then they ask us for the lower bound, all right? So I need to come all the way down from here. So this is going to be 2 standard deviations below the mean. Well, remember, the standard deviation is 0.02, and the mean was 20.05. So let's go back. So we have 20.05, and I want to be 2 standard deviations below, so minus 0.02, and then minus 0.02 again. And so I get 20.01. And some of you are going, well, Mr. Spencer, couldn't I have just subtracted from the previous one, and that would have been fine? Absolutely. All right? So this is 20.01. And then the next one says, what is the upper bound for the plus or minus 2? What is the upper bound? Well, the upper bound is going to be at plus 2. And so, once again, we're 2 standard deviations above. So we start at the mean, 20.05 plus 0.02 plus 0.02. And we end up getting 20.09. So this value right here is 20.09. And I'm going to slide that down. And 20.09 is my upper bound. Now, please remember that between plus or minus 2 standard deviations, so if I now shade from all the way to here, so I'm shaded what I already had shaded, and I shade all the way out to here, this represents approximately 95% of the data. Now it was the part A. All right, so that's question 3. Now we're going to question 4. Now we're moving on to question 5. All right, question 5 is still based on exactly the same scenario, so I'm not going to reread it. And we're going to also continue using the same picture. And it says, what percent of the parts are within plus or minus 3 standard deviations? Once again, we're looking for the empirical rule. So plus or minus 3 standard deviations on the empirical rule, again, this is an estimate, but it's 99.7%. And yes, you need to make sure you have the 0.7. So 99.7%. So not surprisingly, they're going to ask us for the lower bound of that. Well, we've already gotten started with this because we've already drawn our picture. So the lower bound of plus or minus 3 is just at -3. So I want to know this value. So once again, we've started off, we start at the mean. And our mean is at 20.05. And we're going to subtract 0.02 because that's our standard deviation. And we're going to do that 3 times. And 19.99. And I recognize you could have done that several different ways. You didn't have to subtract it just the way I did it. But the main thing is somehow or another, some multiple of 3 times. All right, so we came all the way down to 19.99 being our lower bound. So this is 3 standard deviations below the mean. Not surprisingly, they're going to ask us for the upper value. So what is our what is the upper bound for plus or minus 3 standard deviations? That means they're looking for this value. Again, it's 3 standard deviations above. So 20.05 plus 0.02 plus 0.02 plus 0.02. I had to add it 3 times because we're 3 standard deviations above, and I get 20.11. So 3 standard deviations above the mean is at 20.11, which is right here. And now if I shade all the way below, all the way up, I didn't shade everything because this actually goes to positive, or goes to negative infinity on this side and goes to positive infinity on this side. But between plus or minus 3 standard deviations is 99.7% of the data. All right, so 99.7% is within plus or minus 3. My lower bound was 19.99. My upper bound was 20.11. All right, and that includes this particular video.